You're watching Arise America. Welcome back. The EU ambassadors are holding emergency talks today after US President Donald Trump threatened tariffs on European allies over Greenland. Trump announced a 10% tariff on goods from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, Netherlands and Finland starting February 1, which could rise to 25% by June 1 if the US doesn't reach a deal to buy Greenland. European leaders are pushing back, with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warning of a dangerous downward spiral and French President Emmanuel Macron calling the tariffs unacceptable. The EU is considering countermeasures, including limiting access to public tenders or restricting trade in services. Greenland's leaders are rejecting the idea of selling, with protests in Nuuk and Copenhagen. Well, Joy John joins me now from Washington, D.C. to discuss this emergency meeting by the EU over Trump's tariffs or threats on countries opposed to his ambitious Greenland takeover. Good to have you this weekend. Sorry for the hitches earlier. Why is Greenland very crucial to the U.S. and how will Denmark's sovereignty claims affect negotiations? Let's push aside what Trump said about, national security. What do you think, in your perspective, is the reason why the United States dearly needs Greenland?
Yes, thanks for having me. So Greenland matters to the U.S. for three reasons. You have the Arctic security, you have the missile early warnings, and emergency lanes as the ice melts, due to global warming. The U.S. has operated in Greenland since the World War II, and Washington has often tried to compartmentalize those security interests. With that said, Denmark's sovereignty is not disputed in any way, but I would say that their autonomy means they must balance U.S. security interests and, Danish legal authority and Greenlandic consent at this point. So that's why it's very important. It's very strategic. There's a lot of mineral wealth there that the U.S. has its eye on. So yes, in a nutshell, that's why it's very important to the U.S.
So do you think the EU will activate countermeasures on the US, and how impactful will those measures be?
Yes. So here, the European Union prefers the escalation, but it will act if necessary. Countermeasures would be targeted and proportionate, designed to create some kind of leverage rather than a shock. But to the second part of your question on its impact, yes, the impact will be meaningful politically, that is, especially in sensitive U.S. sectors, but economically it will be contained to avoid mutual damage. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say, what I mean is that the European Union will design its countermeasures to create political pressure rather than widespread economic harm for the people. At the same time, the measures will be limited and targeted so they don't significantly disrupt any transatlantic trade or damage European industries.
Right. So how will the EU's, WTO case against U.S. tariffs play out, and what's the potential outcome of that?
So legally, the case put up by the European Union is strong under the rules outlined by the WTO. However, the timelines are long and enforcement is weakened by the appellate body crisis here. Well, the likely outcome will not be immediate, like tariff removal. What it would do is to add pressure for some, negotiations to get started or settlement, rather than one party claiming pure legal victory.
So can the EU effectively counter the US's tariff threats without escalating a trade war?
Yes, indeed. It can, if it stays disciplined, absolutely. The approach of the European Union is more of a collaborated deterrence, combining legal action, also targeted retaliation and diplomatic engagement. Typically, escalations happen when, the measures in place become expansive or politically charged. An irascible leadership style will continue to complicate efforts to manage disagreements quietly. So it's important that those at the helm of affairs, or the parties involved, are not defined or referred to as irascible in any way. They have to be calm-headed, to negotiate at the table and manage disagreements quietly, because if you have an irascible leader or one who has an irascible style of leadership, it would definitely complicate things, even when the strategic interests align. Tone and approach make the escalation more difficult.
Absolutely. So how will the EU suspension of the US trade deal, if they decide to do that, how will it
I think I
impact
lost you there.
negotiations? And what's the likelihood of a comprehensive trade agreement? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'll take that question again. How will the EU suspension of the US trade deal impact negotiations? And what's the likelihood of a comprehensive trade agreement?
So suspending talks indicates a level of seriousness. It underscores the resolve of the European Union without closing the door entirely. Looking at the picture, it will slow progress and strain confidence, but it would still leave a space for dialogue to resume. And given today's political climate, a sweeping agreement is very unlikely, Olivia, I will tell you. And I would say that the sector by sector arrangements are the more practical way forward at this time, given what we have on ground.
Now, what are the implications of the US's actions on NATO's Arctic strategy and European security?
Yes, the pressure from the US alone is very hard, or let me say harder, for NATO to stay aligned in the Arctic. Allies typically work hand in hand, and they broadly agree on strategic challenges in the Arctic, particularly from Russia and China. However, unilateral decision or unilateral moves by the US can obfuscate shared objectives, making it harder for NATO to maintain clarity and cohesion in, such an insensitive, I would say, increasingly sensitive region. So any unilateral move by the US will obfuscate the shared objectives. It's going to be very hard. Lasting security in the region will depend on, steady cooperation amongst them, not, deal by deal bargaining, especially with the increase in military activity in that region at this time.
All right, then. Thank you so much for joining us, Joy John. We had to do a brief chat on that. Let's see the outcome of that meeting with the EU. And of course, we would take it up from there. Appreciate you. She's an international or global affairs expert. Had to join us from Washington, D.C.